Welcome to the best horror movie you never saw, where we get the opportunity to shine a light on horror movies that you may have missed, haven't seen in a while, or just plain forgot about. On this episode, we take a look at James Isaac's The Horror Show, starring Lance Henriksen, Brian James, Tom Bray, Rita Taggart, and Dee Dee Pfeiffer. The film that may or may not be the third entry of the House franchise, which seemed to begin as horror comedies that could possibly be viewed by children. Is there a tangible connection between The Horror Show and the House series? Well, let's find out. I want to thank you guys for watching the best horror movie you never saw and ask that if you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now. Like the video and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes up. And now, back to the show. The House franchise, which began in 1986 with a film directed by Steve Miner and produced by Sean S. Cunningham of Friday the 13th fame, has become known throughout the years for having 4 entries in the series that are largely unrelated, besides the fact that the central action of the film involves a mysterious, creepy house. The first movie functions as a horror comedy, while 1987's House 2, the second story, goes even lighter in tone than its predecessor as a new supernatural comedy that doesn't involve the storyline or characters from the first film. At least House 2 has a tangible tonal relation to the first movie, which makes it feel more at home within the franchise, because the same can't be said about 1989's House 3. Or is that House 3 The Horror Show? Perhaps it's just The Horror Show. Maybe all 3 are accurate, depending on where you live and how you were introduced to the film that may just be part of the House franchise in name only. Confused yet? It's that uncertain pedigree that, at the very least, makes the movie fascinating to dive into. The whole concept of a film being connected to a larger franchise in name only generally occurs when a derivative work, typically a remake, adaptation, or reimagining, is so different from the work it took its name from that the only thing tying it to the original material is the title, possibly a few characters, and even the broadest connection to the actual premise. Essentially, you could have the project stand perfectly on its own if references to the source material were removed. House and House 2, the second story, even lacking direct storyline and character connections, at least involves a similar supernatural element involving comedy and a haunting of sorts within the home. The Horror Show plays things a bit darker and centers on a vicious serial killer named Meat Cleaver Max Jenke, who's played by Brian James, and a detective named Lucas McCarthy, played by Lance Henriksen, who is hot on his trail. When Meat Cleaver Max is finally brought down by McCarthy, the crazed serial killer won't let an inconvenience like death stop his murderous rampage. Meat Cleaver Max seems to meet his end after a stint in the electric chair, but crazed killer vowed revenge before he met his end, and he's determined to get it, even beyond the grave.
Coming back to fuck you up.
Meat Cleaver Max is intent on piling up his body count and living up to his deal with the devil to frame McCarthy for his murders. The house comes into play when Meat Cleaver Max begins scaring the McCarthy family, who have moved into a new home, and the parapsychologist they have hired named Peter Campbell, who's played by Tom Bray, who explains to them that the only hope to stop Meat Cleaver Max for good is to destroy his evil spirit. And there we have our broad connection to the premise of the first 2 House movies. Initially released in the US as The Horror Show, which allowed it to be free from the ties of the House franchise name, the film has taken its place over the years as a legit part of the House series, even though it truly lacks any real connection to its predecessors. While the film was branded as The Horror Show in the States, it was released as House 3 in Europe, and it was distributed as House 3 The Horror Show on home video, October 1989. Perhaps because the film flopped at the box office in the US, producer Sean S. Cunningham figured the brand recognition of the House name would give it an assist in foreign markets. It might confuse you even more that when they got to making a real sequel in the franchise, they kept the numbering based solely on the foreign distribution title being House 3 and not The Horror Show. That means if you went to the video store in the 90s, now keep up, and felt like having a complete House marathon, you only ever found House House 2, and House 4 on the horror shelf and not House 3, regardless of whether it's in the franchise or out of it, there's no denying that the horror show has some fun moments to offer fans of the genre. For starters, the horror show doesn't skimp on bloodshed, and it's loaded with profanities.
He's coming back.
What the fuck are you talking about?
It's not over yet. He's coming back
I
for
need
you.
this like a fucking hole in the head.
If you like your horror films with characters that swear like sailors, this one's for you. And in terms of gore and the effects work on display, the excessively graphic scenes that dominate the horror show are generally top-notch. With work from the likes of Greg Nicotero and Howard Berger, you know you're going to get some practical makeup effects to remember. Look to when Meat Cleaver Max is put to death in a very memorable execution that shows the character coming to a very messy end, or an intense sequence involving Lucas trying to capture Max, who has body parts all over his kitchen. A lot of the film really is a gore fiend's dream, and it certainly doesn't lack in that department or seem stifled by the film's limited budget. So let's talk the film's cast, which has Lance Henriksen leading the way as an always reliable presence in a movie like this. I mean, pick your poison. This is a man who's appeared in genre classics like The Terminator, Aliens, Near Dark, and Pumpkinhead, so you know you're always going to get a committed performance. And in all honesty, Henriksen gives the material a lot more value because his cliched tormented cop character is given considerable power based on his performance. The character always seems like he's on the verge of exploding, which at times makes him more frightening than his opponent. Ryan James is certainly fun to watch as Meat Cleaver Max, and is genuinely frightening during certain moments with a signature evil laugh to match his depravity. The behind-the-scenes team offers a connection between this film and his predecessors, as the photography of Mac Alberg is back on display, but he gives this installment a more grounded look when compared to the previous House films. Composer Harry Manfredini, who has been in league with producer Sean S. Cunningham since composing Friday the 13th, is also on board providing the score for this film after clearly having a lot of fun with House and House 2. Now, if you're wanting a story that makes a lot of sense, you might be left wanting. If you pay attention to the credits, you'll notice that Alan Smithy is credited as one of the two screenwriters.
You gotta be fucking kidding me.
Alan Smithy is a commonly used pseudonym for someone who doesn't want to be credited on a film. And in this case, it was Alan Warner who tried to pretend like the horror show doesn't exist. To the writer's credit, they do craft some interesting moments that play well during the film. The constant repetition of wondering about what might be going on does create some anxiety. This proves to be very true during a scene where McCarthy is yelling at Max, but everybody else thinks he's yelling at his daughter Bonnie's boyfriend, which nicely leads into McCarthy being accused of his murder later on. No one is winning any Academy Awards for Best Original Screenplay here, but I wouldn't say it's worthy of the Alan Smithy treatment. Another interesting behind-the-scenes tidbit about the horror show is that director David Blythe was replaced by James Isaac, and the late James Isaac ends up being the perfect choice for the job due to his career creating creatures in such films as Gremlins, and he also did work on House 2: The Second Story. Isaac made his directorial debut on the horror show, and he would go on to direct Jason X and Skinwalkers. In an interesting late 80s horror twist, the horror show does end up sharing some similarities with the Wes Craven 1989 film Shocker, which arrived a few months after the horror show. They both featured crazed killers who vow revenge while being executed, and then end up coming back through fairly ludicrous means. In Shocker, Horace Pinker makes a deal with the devil and comes back as pure electricity with the ability to possess others to continue his murderous rage and get revenge on young Jonathan. In the horror show, Meat Cleaver Max is executed, makes a deal with the devil in order to continue his revenge, and becomes a ghost, hiding in a basement boiler. Horace Pinker obviously got the better end of the afterlife evil powers and hiding places, but I'm pretty sure we missed a good opportunity for some kind of crossover movie. Could Shocker very well be the real House 4? Maybe House 3.5? I'm willing to hear any idea that would make this mashup work. I honestly think the legacy of the horror show, or whatever you choose to call it, is that it kind of built up a reputation as a lost film because you could never really find it as House 3, at least here in the States. So the third film always felt like some mystery. Thanks to the power of the internet, we all know why we could never locate it, because as we glanced over the horror show, we had no idea we were overlooking the long-lost third entry of the House franchise. In all honesty, the horror show is a bit of a tonal whiplash after the horror comedy that was House and the lighthearted monster movie Antics of House 2, but that doesn't make it any less fun to watch and makes for a fun debate with other horror fans about its true placement in the franchise or as merely a standalone effort waiting to be discovered by more people.
Fuck you!